Hey guys, tonight, before we go a single step further, I need you to picture something. Not a happy picture. Not the kind of picture they put on the cover of a children's book. I need you to picture a garden. A small, ordinary garden, sitting behind a one-room cabin on the Kansas frontier in the spring of 1873. Fresh soil on top. Always fresh soil. Not because this was a particularly productive growing season. Not because this family had an unusual love of vegetables. Fresh soil. Every time a neighbour passed. Every time a traveller glanced over from the road. Nobody asked why. Not for 2 years. And when they finally did ask, when a group of men with shovels finally walked up to that little patch of turned earth on a warm May morning in 1873 and decided they were going to get an answer, what they found in that garden changed the American frontier forever. It put the name of one woman on the front page of every major newspaper in the country. And it started a story that has never, not once in 150 years, been fully resolved. That woman's name was Kate Bender. And tonight, we're going to follow her story all the way to the edge of the prairie. All the way to the place where she disappeared. Settle in, get comfortable. Because what I am about to tell you is 100% documented American history. It is stranger than anything anyone could make up. And it involves a family that you think you know. A family whose story has been told so many times, in so many forms, that it has become part of the furniture of this country's imagination, in a way that most people have never heard. Here is what you need to know first. The year is 1871. Somewhere in the southeastern corner of Kansas, a man named Charles Ingalls has just packed his family into a covered wagon and pointed it north toward Wisconsin. His wife Caroline sits beside him. His daughters, Mary and Laura, are tucked in the back. Baby Carrie, less than a year old, is bundled in Caroline's arms. They are leaving Kansas because the land they thought was theirs turned out not to be. It was Osage land. The government had promised it would be opened for settlement. It had not been. And rather than wait to be removed at bayonet point, Charles Ingalls, being the kind of man he was, left on his own terms. Laura had just turned 4 years old. She would not remember all of it. But she would remember enough. Now hold that image, that wagon rolling north, that little girl in the back, that family putting Kansas behind them. Hold it, because we are going to need it later. We are going to need it very much. Because 2 years after that wagon rolled away from Kansas, 2 full years after little Laura said goodbye to the prairie she would one day make famous, something happened on that same stretch of frontier that would eventually circle back to the Ingalls family in one of the most extraordinary ways in the history of American storytelling. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to the beginning. The Kansas of 1869 and 1870 was not the sunlit place in the storybooks. Not by any honest measure. It smelled of iron-rich soil and animal sweat and wood smoke, and something underneath all of it that settlers along the Osage Trail could never quite name. Something that came with the land itself. The open country of southeastern Kansas was beautiful, the way dangerous things are beautiful, enormous and unforgiving and utterly indifferent to whether you lived or died on it. The families streaming into this territory from Wisconsin, Illinois and Missouri in those years were chasing a rumour. The federal government, people said, was going to open Indian territory for white settlement. The Osage people, whose land this legally was, whose ancestors had walked this prairie for generations before a single covered wagon crossed the horizon, were being pressured into selling what was called the Osage Diminished Reserve. Once they agreed, the thinking went, the land would be surveyed, parcelled out, and made available for purchase, and the families who arrived first would have first claim on the best pieces of it. This was the plan. There was one problem with this plan. The Osage had not agreed to anything yet. The families flooding into this territory in 1869 and 1870, Charles Ingalls among them, had no legal right to be there. The 1870 United States Census recorded the Ingalls household as the 89th residents of Rutland Township in Montgomery County, Kansas. 89th. That tells you something about how many families had made the same calculation at the same time. They were not pioneers pushing into an empty wilderness. They were a crowd of hopeful, anxious people standing on someone else's land, waiting for the paperwork to catch up with their presence. And then the paperwork never came, at least not the way they hoped. Through the fall of 1870 and into 1871, the Osage were being moved south off the reserve they had been promised. the route of their departure passing near the Ingalls cabin. Laura was 3 years old. She watched. She remembered, in the way that children remember things, not as narrative, not as clear sequence, but as feeling, as weight, as something that settled into her bones and stayed there for the rest of her life. And by spring 1871, the Ingalls were gone too, not removed, not forced out at gunpoint, though that possibility had been very real for a while. Charles Ingalls left on his own terms. The Wisconsin buyer who had agreed to take his property back there couldn't make the payments. The Kansas land required cash he didn't have. The arithmetic of frontier life, which never quite added up the way a man with Charles Ingalls' optimism expected it to, had failed him again. He packed the wagon. Baby Carrie was not yet a year old. Laura had just turned 4. They drove north. Now, here is the date that matters. Write it somewhere in the back of your mind. Spring 1871. The Ingalls family leaves Kansas in the spring of 1871. This is documented. This is confirmed by land records, family accounts, and the scholarship of the Pioneer Girl Project, the academic research organisation dedicated to verifying every claim in Laura's own memoir. There is no serious historical debate about this date. The Ingalls were gone from Kansas in the spring of 1871. Hold that. Approximately 50 miles to the southeast, across county lines into Labette County, near the growing settlement of Cherryvale, a piece of land in Osage Township was about to acquire a new set of residents. The man who came first called himself John Bender. He filed a homestead claim on 160 acres in late 1870. His son, or the man he called his son, filed alongside him. The younger man went by John Bender as well, though some historical records list him as John Gebhardt, a name that has kept historians busy for 150 years, because the question of who this family actually was, what their real names were, and where they truly came from has never been fully answered. It probably never will be. What we know is this. The land John Bender chose was not the finest farmland in Labette County. It was not the richest soil, the most sheltered ground, the piece of prairie that an experienced Kansas farmer would have selected for growing crops. It lacked almost every quality a sensible homesteader would have prioritized. But it had one thing. It had the road. The Osage Trail, sometimes called the Great Osage Trail, sometimes the Osage Mission Trail, the name shifting depending on who you asked, ran directly alongside the Bender property, not near it, alongside it. Any traveller moving between the established settlements to the north and east and the Indian Territory to the south would pass, unavoidably, directly in front of that homestead. That was not an accident. That was a decision. And when you understand it as a decision, when you understand that everything the Benders built and did and presented to the world was built around that road, and the people on it, the rest of what happened begins to make a cold, methodical kind of sense that has nothing to do with impulse and everything to do with patience. After the land was filed, a woman arrived. She went by Ma Bender, or Mrs. Bender, depending on who was asking. She was described by people who encountered her as taciturn, difficult, and impossible to warm up to. Her real name has never been confirmed. Newspaper accounts of 1873 speculated she had been born Elmira Hill in the Adirondack Mountains of New York, with multiple husbands and a violent history behind her. But those accounts came from the same newspapers that would describe Kate Bender as a supernatural seductress, so take them for what they are worth. The honest answer is that nobody knows who Ma Bender was. The honest answer is that almost nobody knows who any of the Benders really were. And then there was Kate. Contemporary accounts describe Kate Bender as being in her mid-20s when the family was operating the inn. She spoke English fluently, and without the heavy accent that limited the older Benders to silence with English-speaking travellers. She was the only one of the 4 who moved through the surrounding community with any ease. She gave public lectures on spiritualism, a movement that had drawn millions of followers across America in the years after the Civil War, when a nation ground down by grief and loss was hungry for any system that promised contact with the dead. She advertised herself as a healer, as a medium. She held seances in the cabin. Contemporary descriptions of her appearance swing so wildly that they tell you more about the writers than they do about Kate. One newspaper called her repulsive-looking, with a vicious and cruel eye. Another described her as good-looking and well-formed, though noted she had a boldness about her that made men uneasy. A third made her sound almost supernatural, as though her face itself was a kind of trap. Strip all of that away. What remains, when you look only at what is documented and consistent across the accounts that survived, is something more quietly unsettling than any of those descriptions. Kate Bender was a young woman who understood what people needed and presented herself as someone who had it to offer. She was forward and educated in ways that were genuinely unusual for a woman in her position and time. She had chosen to be the public face of a roadside inn on one of the most dangerous stretches of frontier in southeastern Kansas, and she was extraordinarily good at her job. The inn that the Benders built was modest by any measure. A one-room wooden cabin, approximately 16 by 24 feet. A canvas wagon curtain divided the space, the front half open to travellers, a dry goods counter along one wall, a table set for meals, and Kate holding the room together with conversation. The back half was the family's private space. Sleeping quarters, they said. Storage. And on the floor of the front room, positioned near the table, a trapdoor. For vegetables, they said. The garden behind the house was always freshly turned. Always. Travellers who stopped and then kept riding often noticed it without quite being able to say why it registered. A family that tended their garden. A family that took pride in their land. Nothing unusual about that. Not on the frontier, not in 1871 or 1872, when there were crops to plant and cattle to move, and 100 other pressing concerns crowding out any single observation that did not yet have enough weight to demand attention. Nobody looked any closer, not for 2 years. Here is something about the way this operation worked that I want you to sit with for a moment, because it is the thing that separates the Bloody Benders from almost every other criminal case of the 19th century. They were not impulsive. The violence, when it came, was quick. By all the evidence we have, the work of seconds. But what surrounded the violence, what made the violence possible, what allowed it to continue on one of the busiest travel corridors in southeastern Kansas for nearly 2 years without exposure, that was not quick at all. That was patience. That was a calculation. That was the slow, deliberate work of people who had looked at a road and a canvas curtain and a trapdoor, and understood exactly what those three things could do together, with the right person managing the table. A traveller would stop at the Bender Inn, drawn in by the promise of a hot meal and a dry place to rest after days on the road. Kate would take the lead in welcoming them, warm, attentive, genuinely engaging in a way that travellers on a lonely frontier road did not often encounter. The visitor would be guided to a specific seat at the table. Their back to the canvas curtain, Kate is in front of them. Behind the curtain, one of the male Benders, John Sneer or John Jr., waited in silence with a heavy hammer. The blow came from behind, skull fracture, throat cut, body through the trapdoor and into the small cellar below, while the family moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this before and fully intended to do it again. Under the cover of darkness, the body was carried out and buried in the garden. The horses and wagon were moved off the property before dawn. By the time the next traveller arrived, the garden had fresh soil on top. Nothing out of place. The guests kept coming. The road kept running. The bodies kept accumulating. For 2 years. Now. Here is the question that sits at the centre of everything we're going to spend the next several hours on. How? How do you murder at least 11 people? 11 confirmed by the 1873 investigation, with some later estimates suggesting the true number may have been higher, though historians caution that anything above 11 belongs in the category of possible rather than proven. On a busy public road, in broad daylight, in a community of neighbours who were close enough to notice that your garden was always freshly turned. How do you do that without being caught for 2 years? The answer to that question is not comfortable, because the answer is not that the Benders were unusually clever, though they were careful. It is not that the frontier was unusually lawless, though it was. The answer is something quieter and more disturbing than either of those things. The answer is that people are remarkably, almost heroically good at not seeing what they do not want to see. The travellers who stopped at the Bender Inn and kept going, the ones who ate Kate's food and felt vaguely unsettled and drove their wagons back out onto the road and filed the experience away under nothing important. Most of them never knew how close they had come. Some of them found out later, Some found out by reading the same newspaper accounts that told the rest of America about the garden that would not stop giving up bodies. And some of them, in the years that followed, began to remember their time in southeastern Kansas differently than they had before, began to fold the Bender story into their own family histories in ways that felt true, that rang with the emotional reality of having lived near something that terrible, even when the specific details did not quite align with the documented record. This is not unusual. This is deeply, profoundly human. And it is exactly what Laura Ingalls Wilder would do 60 years later, when she stood before a crowd of admirers in Detroit and told them about the night Pa took his rifle down from above the door. But we are not there yet. First, you need to understand what the Benders were truly capable of. You need to understand what was buried in that garden. And there is one name in particular, the smallest name on the list of confirmed victims, that I need you to hear before we go any further. Her name was Mary Ann Longcor. Contemporary accounts placed her age at somewhere between 18 months and 8 years old. The historical record has never fully resolved the dispute. She was a child, and when the men with the shovels reached her grave in May of 1873, what they found there made even the most hardened frontier lawmen go quiet. We will get to that. Stay with me. The best part of tonight, and the most important part, is still ahead. Mary Ann Longcor was a little girl. Her exact age has never been confirmed. Contemporary accounts placed her somewhere between a toddler and 8 years old, and the historical record has never settled the dispute. What is confirmed is that she was a child, and that she was travelling with her father, George Newton Longcor, in the winter of 1872. They were leaving Independence, Kansas, heading north toward Iowa, toward relatives, toward what Longcor hoped would be a new start after the death of his wife. He was the kind of man the frontier produced in great numbers, widowed too early, moving too fast, carrying too many hopes in too light a wagon. He had a little girl beside him. They took the road north. They never arrived. The horse team that belonged to George Longcor was found wandering without a driver sometime later, loose, unhitched, grazing along the road with no one behind them and no explanation in sight. A neighbour who knew Longcor recognised the animals. He asked around. He made inquiries. He found nothing. The Longcors had simply ceased to exist somewhere along a stretch of open Kansas road that hundreds of other travellers rode every week without incident. A local doctor named William York heard about it. He knew the Longcors. He knew the route. He began, quietly and carefully, to investigate on his own, asking questions at the farmhouses and stopping points along the Osage Trail, trying to piece together where a man and his little girl could have vanished without a single witness, coming forward to say what had happened to them. In March of 1873, Dr. William York set out on one of those inquiry rides himself. He was last seen heading south along the Osage Mission Road. He did not come back. Now here is what I want you to understand about the spring of 1873, because this is the part of the story that most tellings get wrong by making it feel like a sudden revelation, like the whole truth fell out of the sky one afternoon into the laps of a shocked community. It did not happen that way. What happened was slower than that, quieter than that, more human than that. The disappearances along the Osage Trail had been building for nearly 2 years before anyone put all the pieces together. Men would set out along the road. Men would fail to arrive. People would ask questions, answers wouldn't come. And because this was 1871, 1872 frontier Kansas, where men wandered and roads were rough and letters took weeks, and there was no central registry of missing persons, no way to look at a map and draw a line between the departures, each absence could be explained 100 different ways. Maybe he took a different route. Maybe he decided to push on to the next county without stopping. Maybe he found work somewhere and hadn't written yet. Maybe. The first body attributed to the Benders by later historians was found in Drum Creek in May of 1871. A man with a crushed skull and a cut throat. The investigation at the time went nowhere. The death was noted. No suspect was identified. The Bender homestead, which had opened its doors to travellers along the Osage Trail sometime in 1871, was not yet on anyone's list of concerns. The disappearances that followed were individual, scattered, and separated by just enough time and distance that no one in the community was seeing the same picture all at once. A man named Ben Brown, a man named W.F. McCrotty, a man named Henry Mackenzie. Names attached to reported absences in Labette County histories, men who set out along familiar roads and failed to reach their destinations. Nobody connected them publicly. Nobody had reason to yet. Then Longcor and his daughter vanished. Then Dr. York went looking for them and vanished too, and then York's brother arrived. Colonel Alexander M. York was a different category of man than most of the people looking into disappearances along the Osage Trail. He was a Civil War veteran, a lawyer, a sitting member of the Kansas State Senate. He had resources, and more importantly, he had the particular kind of cold fury that belongs to people who are both grieving and powerful. People who cannot be fobbed off with polite suggestions that perhaps his brother had just ridden on ahead without telling anyone. His brother was gone. Alexander York was going to find out why. He organised a search with systematic patience, leading a company of some 50 men personally. He rode the route himself more than once, stopping at every trading post and farmhouse and roadside stopping point along the stretch of the Osage Trail where William had last been seen. He asked the same question at every door. "Have you seen my brother?" At the Bender homestead, they said no. He noted it and kept riding. But Alexander York was not the only person becoming alarmed. By April of 1873, the community's anxiety had reached a level that demanded a formal response. In March of 1873, around the 10th, according to the Cyclopedia of Kansas, local settlers gathered at a small schoolhouse called Harmony Grove to discuss the pattern of disappearances. They had no unified suspect. They had no evidence they could point to. What they had was a growing collective unease that something in their community was deeply, systematically wrong. At that meeting, a neighbour named Colonel York attended. So did both Bender men, Pa Bender and John Jr., who sat among their neighbours, listened to the list of the missing, and when other men around the room voluntarily offered to have their own farm searched, said nothing. The man who historians believe helped kill at least 11 people sat in a schoolhouse with his neighbours and discussed the disappearances as though he were just another worried resident of Labette County. He left the meeting. He went home. 3 weeks later, the Bender homestead was empty. The family had been gone for approximately 3 to 4 weeks by the time anyone noticed. That is the detail that tends to stop people cold when they encounter it, because it means that the Benders were already well into their escape before a single alarm was raised. They had walked out the front door of their cabin, or the back, or across the open prairie depending on which account you trust, and simply disappeared into the same landscape that had swallowed their victims. It was a neighbour named Billy Toll who first realised something was wrong. He passed the Bender property and noticed the livestock. The animals were still there, cattle and horses standing in the fields, unfed, unhappy, making the kind of noise that livestock make when they have been neglected past the point of patience. Billy Toll had seen abandoned homesteads before. Families left sometimes, under the cover of darkness when debts or illness or despair made staying impossible. But they didn't usually leave the animals behind. He reported it to the township trustee, a man named Leroy Dick. Leroy Dick went to look. The cabin was empty. The door was unlocked. The interior was in partial disorder. Not ransacked, not dramatic. Just the specific kind of disarray that suggested a quick departure. Some items left behind, some taken. The canvas curtain still divided the room. The dry goods still sat on the counter. The table where travellers had eaten their last meals was still in its place near the wall, positioned so that a seated guest would have their back to the partition. The trapdoor in the floor was latched. Leroy Dick did not open it. Not yet. He called a community search instead. On May 5th and 6th, 1873, a group of men converged on the Bender property with shovels, poles, and the specific grim determination of people who already suspected they knew what they were going to find. They moved through the cabin first. They pried up the trap door. The smell told them everything before they saw anything. The cellar beneath was small, 6 or 7 feet deep, barely large enough to stand in. The floor of it was soaked and dark. The wooden walls were marked in ways that required no expert interpretation. This was not a vegetable cellar. This had never been a vegetable cellar. They went outside, to the garden. The first body they recovered was Dr. William York. He was identified by his brother, Senator Alexander York, who had been riding back and forth across this stretch of Kansas for 2 months, asking after him. What he found when the men lifted the shovel from the orchard soil was not the brother he had been looking for. The body had been there for weeks. The injuries were consistent with everything the cellar had already told them. They kept digging. By the time the work was done on May 6th and 7th, 1873, men had recovered at least 11 bodies from the orchard, the well, and the ground surrounding the Bender homestead. 8 from the garden itself, others from the nearby well and the surrounding land. The victims included George Newton Longcor, who had left Independence with his little girl in the winter of 1872, hoping to make it to Iowa. The 1870 United States Census records George Newton Longcor as a neighbour of Charles Ingalls in Independence. The same man whose little girl now lay in this orchard had lived within walking distance of the family Laura Ingalls would one day make famous. His daughter was buried beside him. Contemporary accounts, newspaper reports from 1873 preserved in the Labette County histories, described what the examination of her body suggested with a detail so disturbing that newspapers across the country carried it on their front pages. Newspapers in 1873 reported something even more disturbing, that Mary Ann may have been buried alive. No visible injuries. Fully clothed in mittens and a hood, found beside her father. The forensic evidence was inconclusive, but the theory spread across every front page in the country. What is certain is that a child ended up in that orchard, and the weight of that fact needed no embellishment. A little girl, however young she was, and was buried alive in a Kansas orchard. The newspapers in 1873 described a nation in shock, not just at the scale of the murders, though 11 bodies recovered from a single-family homestead was unprecedented in American crime history to that point, but at the specific quality of the crime, at the deliberateness, during the duration, at the fact that this had gone on for nearly 2 years in a community where people knew the Benders, shopped at their store, ate at their table, and sat across from Kate in that small front room while one of the men waited in silence behind the curtain. And at the fact that Kate Bender, the spiritualist, the healer, the woman who had lectured publicly on communing with the dead, had been right there in the middle of all of it. The newspapers called them the Bloody Benders, and that name crossed the country within days. Here is where I want to slow down for a moment, because there is a question that the 1873 newspapers did not ask, a question that the shocked crowds who descended on the Bender property in the days after the bodies were found did not stop to consider, but that is, I think, the most important question this entire story raises. Not how did this happen, but who saw it and looked away? The Benders operated on one of the busiest roads in southeastern Kansas. They ran a business. They had regular customers. Neighbours passed their property every week. Kate gave public lectures in the surrounding community. John Jr. attended a town meeting in April of 1873, just weeks before the cabin was found empty, and sat alongside the men discussing the very disappearances his family had caused. This was not a hidden operation. It was hiding in plain sight, and the reason it could hide in plain sight for nearly 2 years on a public road in a settled community tells you something specific and unsettling about how violence operates in places where people are too busy surviving to stop and ask why the neighbour's garden is always freshly turned. There was one more layer to this that almost nobody talked about at the time. The victims who disappeared along the Osage Trail were not random. They were travellers. Men moving alone, or with small families between settlements, people whose absence could be attributed to the natural geography of frontier life, where men pushed on without writing letters and changed their plans without notice. The Benders had not selected victims carelessly. They had understood, with the cold clarity of practiced predators, exactly which kind of person the frontier would fail to miss quickly enough to cause them trouble. And they had been right, for 2 years. Now I want you to hold a number in your mind. The reward posted for the capture of the Benders after the bodies were discovered was $1,000 from Senator Alexander York personally. Governor Thomas Osborne of Kansas added $2,000 on top of that, $3,000 total, a sum that in 1873 represented years of wages for most working families on the frontier. Nobody collected it. Not then, not ever. No one came forward with a convincing account of where the Benders had gone. Nobody was produced. No capture was confirmed. No legal proceeding was opened. The reward sat unclaimed, and the Benders moved through the American landscape as smoke moves through a doorway. Present one moment, gone the next, and impossible to hold. Senator Alexander York, the man who had ridden back and forth across Labette County for months looking for his brother, who had attended the Harmony Grove meeting and demanded that every farm be searched, who had identified his brother's body in the orchard of the people who had killed him, Alexander York would spend years afterward trying to find where the Benders had gone. He never did. And the mystery that opened on the Kansas Prairie in May of 1873, when the Benders walked out of that empty cabin and into the untracked frontier, is the same mystery that is still open today. Nobody knows where Kate Bender went. Nobody knows what name she used after she left. Nobody knows whether she lived out her days quietly, in some ordinary town, in some unremarkable house, with a garden of her own outside the window. The thought of that, of what it means, of what it says, is something we will return to. But first, I need to tell you about the woman who knew something had changed on the Kansas frontier. Not Kate, not Ma Bender. A 4-year-old girl in a covered wagon heading north toward Wisconsin, carried away from the prairie she would spend the rest of her life trying to describe. Laura Ingalls never forgot Kansas. The question is, what exactly did she remember? Before we follow the Benders into the void they disappeared into, I want to go back. Not to the garden, not to the cellar, not to the orchard in May of 1873 where a senator identified his brother's body in the turned soil. I want to go back to a Sunday afternoon in Labette County, Kansas, sometime in 1872. A modest room. A dozen people were seated in rough chairs, pressed close together in the small space. A young woman standing at the front, not behind a counter, not behind a curtain, but in front, fully visible, speaking with the calm authority of someone who has done this before and expects to be taken seriously. Her name, she said, was Kate Bender, and she was about to tell them how to speak to the dead. Spiritualism was not a fringe movement in 1870s America. This is something worth understanding before we spend any more time with Kate, because the modern tendency is to hear the word séance and picture something theatrical and obviously fraudulent. A darkened room, a woman in a veil, theatrical tricks designed to fool the credulous. That is not what spiritualism looked like to millions of Americans in 1872. Spiritualism had swept across the country beginning in the late 1840s, gaining enormous momentum after the Civil War, when the nation had lost somewhere between 620,000 and 750,000 soldiers in 4 years of industrial-scale slaughter. The exact count was never fully resolved, because neither army kept standardized records of their dead. An entire generation of American women had watched their fathers, brothers, sons and husbands leave and not come back. The hunger to believe that those men were still reachable, still present in some form on some other shore, was not weakness. It was grief, looking for somewhere to go. By the early 1870s, spiritualism had attracted some of the most prominent and educated people in the country. Newspaper editors attended séances. Doctors wrote seriously about the phenomenon. Entire communities organized around spiritualist meetings as a regular feature of social life. Kate understood this. She moved through the community around the Bender homestead not as a suspicious outsider, but as a practitioner of something that hundreds of thousands of Americans, including many of the most respected people in the country, considered legitimate. She placed advertisements, small notices, mentioned in local and regional papers, and preserved in Labette County histories, announcing her services as a healer and medium. She gave lectures. People came. People listened. She also gained notoriety in the surrounding community for something beyond the séances, for publicly advocating free love in her lectures, a position so radical for a woman in rural Kansas in 1872 that it drew attention, drew crowds, and drew the particular kind of fascination that tends to attach itself to people who say out loud the things everyone else only thinks. One newspaper account, written after the murders were discovered and the Benders had fled, preserved a detail about one of Kate's lectures that has circulated through Bender histories ever since. According to this report, and I want to be precise here, because this comes from an 1873 newspaper, not from a court transcript, not from a sworn statement, but from the same press that had every commercial incentive to make the story as horrifying as possible. Kate allegedly made a statement in one of her lectures suggesting that what the world called villainy, her soul might read differently. Whether she said exactly that is impossible to verify. What is verifiable is that she said it publicly, in a community where her family was already at that point well into their second year of operation. That detail is either evidence of extraordinary arrogance, or extraordinary conviction, or something else entirely, and something darker and harder to name, which is the specific quality about Kate Bender that has made historians and true crime writers circle her case for 150 years, without ever quite settling on what she was. Here is the honest problem at the centre of Kate Bender's story. We do not know who she was, not really. Contemporary accounts describe her as being in her mid-20s in 1872 and 1873. She spoke English fluently, without the heavy German accent that marked the older Benders' speech, and largely confined them to silence with English-speaking travellers. She was the only one of the four who functioned in the wider community with any ease. Contemporary accounts that agreed on nothing else agreed on this. She was tall for a woman of her time, around 5 feet 6 inches, with auburn hair and the kind of composed, direct manner that people in 1872 did not expect from a young woman running a roadside inn in rural Kansas. She had the education, or the cultivated appearance of education, necessary to give public lectures and advertise professional services in a region where most women her age were occupied with farm work and child-rearing, and had neither the time nor the inclination for public performance. What she actually looked like is a question that the historical record answers in 4 contradictory voices. Harper's Weekly, in 1873, described her as repulsive-looking, with a vicious and cruel eye. A different contemporary account called her good-looking and well-formed, though noted she had a boldness about her that unsettled people. A third described her as strikingly attractive, a fourth as plain and coarse. 4 accounts, 4 completely different women. What this tells us is not that reporters in 1873 were incompetent. It tells us that what people remembered about Kate Bender was not her face. It was the effect she had on a room. They went home and tried to describe her and discovered that what they were actually trying to describe was a feeling. The feeling of being in the presence of someone who was paying attention to you in a way that was flattering and unsettling in equal measure. That quality does not photograph well. It does not translate into a clean physical description. But it is the quality that kept travellers seated in that particular chair, backs to the canvas curtain, long enough for whoever was waiting behind it to act. The question of whether Kate was truly a Bender, truly related to the older man and woman she called her parents, truly a sister to the younger man she called her brother, is one that historians have never fully resolved. The family structure the Benders presented to the Labette County community was a German immigrant couple, husband and wife, and their 2 adult children. This is what they said. This is what neighbours accepted. Nobody in the community seems to have looked very hard at whether it was true. When historians looked hard at it, after 1873 they found the edges of the story did not hold together cleanly. John Bender Jr., the younger man who attended the Harmony Grove meeting in April 1873 alongside his neighbours, discussing the very disappearances his family had caused, appears in some historical records under the name John Gebhardt. A Bible found in the abandoned cabin had an inscription suggesting a different surname. Neighbours who later reflected on the household noted that John Jr. and Kate's relationship had always struck them as odd for a brother and sister. Too close in some ways, too tense in others. Some suspected they were a couple, not siblings, who had adopted the family structure as a convenience, or as a cover, or simply because 2 adults travelling together needed a socially acceptable explanation for their arrangement. As for whether Kate was truly the daughter of the older Benders, the couple who spoke almost no English and whose real names are also unverified, The honest answer is that no document found in the years since 1873 has conclusively established it either way. They called themselves a family. They functioned as a unit. Beyond that, the historical record offers nothing certain. On October 31st, 1889, 16 years after the Benders vanished, a strange proceeding got underway in Niles, Michigan. A woman named Elmira Monroe, also known as Griffith, had filed a larceny complaint against another woman named Sarah Eliza Davis. Before that case could be resolved, someone looked at those two women more carefully, and what they saw stopped the proceedings cold. Word reached Kansas. Officials travelled to Michigan. Affidavits were gathered. The two women were examined, questioned, and held for some time, while the question of whether they were Ma and Kate Bender was formally considered. It collapsed. The women, or their lawyers, produced documentation placing them in Michigan, in verifiable marriages and institutional records, during the years the Benders were operating in Kansas. The timeline, as it was presented to the court, did not support identification. A Kansas judge reviewed the evidence and released both women. The charges were discharged. The question of whether Elmira Monroe and Sarah Eliza Davis were truly the women who had lived in that cabin on the Osage Trail in 1871 and 1873 was never definitively answered. It remains disputed today. Some historians believe the evidence the women produced was genuine, that they were innocent people caught in the gravitational pull of a famous case. Others believe the documentation was manufactured or misread, and that the 1889 Michigan arrests came closer to identifying Kate Bender than any other effort in the history of the search. The reward went uncollected, the case stayed open. And Kate, whoever she truly was, whatever her real name, wherever she went after she walked away from that empty Kansas cabin on or around the night of April 13th, 1873, never surfaced again in any document that has been confirmed. Now, the other woman, 4 years old in a covered wagon, heading north toward Wisconsin in the spring of 1871, carrying Kansas in her bones whether she wanted to or not. Laura Elizabeth Ingalls. Laura's Kansas years were brief, barely 2 years in total, but they left a mark on her that her writing carries even in the passages that seem most carefully edited, most deliberately softened into childhood gold. The Osage who moved through the territory, the isolation of the cabin, the specific kind of fear that a child absorbs from the adults around her without understanding it, feels as texture rather than fact, carries forward into a life without ever being able to name where it came from. She was too young to remember the Benders. She was too young to have heard of the Benders. The inn on the Osage Trail did not become a public presence until 1871, the same year the Ingalls family packed their wagon and left. The murders were not discovered, the bodies were not found, the name Bloody Benders did not appear in a single newspaper until May of 1873, at which point Laura was 6 years old. The Ingalls family had left Kansas 2 years earlier, and by every primary account, including the PBS American Masters timeline and the Minnesota Historical Society, were back in Pepin, Wisconsin, more than 600 miles from the Kansas frontier. Not in Kansas. Not anywhere near Kansas. But the story reached her anyway. The story reached everyone. The Bloody Benders were front-page news from Kansas to New York in the summer of 1873. The details, the trapdoor, the canvas curtain, the garden, the child buried alive, travelled through American newspapers and into American parlours and kitchens and dinner tables for months, and then for years, and then for decades. A family in Minnesota would have read about it, would have talked about it, would have sat at a table and said the words Bloody Benders, and felt the specific chill that comes from proximity, from having lived, only 2 years before, on that same stretch of Kansas frontier. We lived there. We were there. The family had been close enough to feel the gravity of the story, even though they were nowhere near it when the violence happened. And that gap, between where the Ingalls actually were and where the story placed them in Laura's later memory, is the most fascinating psychological territory in this entire case. In 1937, Laura Ingalls Wilder stood before an audience at the Detroit Book Fair. She was 70 years old. She was one of the most widely read authors in the country. The audience adored her. They had come to see the woman behind the books, the real person who had lived the life that millions of American children had read about in school, and she told them a story she had never published, a story about Pa. She described a night when a neighbor rode up to their Kansas cabin and spoke urgently with her father. She described Pa taking his rifle down from its place above the door. She described him telling Ma that the vigilantes were called out. She described him riding away into the darkness with his neighbor. She described him coming home the next day saying nothing, and when pressed saying only, "They will never be found." That phrase, "they will never be found." It is a magnificent piece of storytelling. 5 words that do exactly what the best 5-word sentences do. They fill a room with everything they leave unsaid. They place a man in a night scene on the Kansas prairie and tell you, without telling you, that whatever he did out there is not the kind of thing a gentleman speaks about at the breakfast table. They invite you to supply the image, the rifle, the darkness, the benders, somewhere out ahead of the posse, running. But there is a problem with those 5 words, a problem that the historical record makes impossible to ignore. In the spring and summer of 1873, when the Bender bodies were discovered, and the vigilante parties rode out across Labette County looking for a German family who had vanished into the frontier, Charles Ingalls was back in Wisconsin, more than 600 miles away. He had been away from Kansas for 2 full years. He could not have taken his rifle down from above the door of a Kansas cabin in the summer of 1873 because there was no Kansas cabin. There was no Kansas door. No vigilante call could have reached a man in Wisconsin and sent him riding back across 600 miles of American landscape to join a posse in Labette County. The math does not work. The geography does not work. The timeline does not work. And yet, for the rest of her life, Laura Ingalls Wilder told this story as though it did. She had said it herself at that same Detroit podium in 1937. All I have told is true, but it is not the whole truth. She knew. She always knew. Here is the question that matters, and it is not the one most people ask when they encounter this part of the story. The question most people ask is, did Laura lie? That's the wrong question. The right question is, what does a family need to believe, and why? What does a woman who spent her childhood on a frontier that was both beautiful and genuinely terrifying, a frontier where a family like the Benders could operate for 2 years on a public road, what does that woman need to do with the knowledge that her father, her beloved, fiddle-playing, bear-protecting father, was not there, was not the hunter, was just a man in Wisconsin when the worst thing on the Kansas frontier was brought to light? We will answer that question. But first, there is one more person in this story who has not been properly introduced yet. A person who understood exactly how to take a childhood memory and turn it into something larger than itself, something that could travel, something that could sell. Laura's daughter, Rose Wilder Lane. And what Rose knew about making a story stick is something that changes this entire picture. Rose Wilder Lane was born on December the 5th, 1886, on her parents' homestead near De Smet in Dakota Territory. She came into the world on the frontier, not in a house with a doctor, not in a town with a hospital, but on a claim in the Dakota Prairie in the middle of a December that the territory's records would remember as punishing. 7 years later, when the homestead failed, and the family packed what they had and left for Missouri, they made the journey by covered wagon. Rose was in it. She remembered it. She carried it forward into a life that never quite stopped moving in the specific restless way that Charles and Carolyn Ingalls had modelled for their daughter Laura her entire childhood. Rose came into the world in motion, and she spent the next 60 years moving, from the Dakota Territory to San Francisco, from San Francisco to Albania, from Albania to the ruins of post-war Georgia, from there to Paris, from Paris to a farmhouse in Connecticut, where she would eventually become one of the founding voices of American libertarian thought. She covered the aftermath of the Armenian genocide for the Red Cross. She wrote for the San Francisco Bulletin, and later for the Saturday Evening Post, which was among the most widely read magazines in the country in the 1920s, and the publication whose pages reached more American households than perhaps any other weekly outlet of its era. She was a professional storyteller who understood, with the clarity that only years of working in commercial journalism gives you, exactly what a story needs to do in the first 3 pages to earn the next 300. And in 1930, her mother sent her a manuscript on school tablets. It was called Pioneer Girl. Laura Ingalls Wilder was 63 years old when she began writing Pioneer Girl. She wrote it in pencil, on school tablets, the same kind of composition books that children used in the one-room schoolhouses she had attended and later taught in, on the Dakota Prairie and in Missouri. The handwriting was careful, the sentences plainly constructed, the memories reaching back 60 years to a childhood that had been, by any objective measure, extraordinarily unusual and genuinely dangerous and utterly devoid of the golden light that would later be applied to it by the publishing industry and the culture that industry serves. She wrote down what she remembered. The Osage in the doorway, the wolf pack crosses the frozen creek, the illness that took Mary's sight, the brain fever, the stroke down one side of her face, the nerves of her eyes dying while the doctors watched and could not stop it, the claim shanties on the Dakota Prairie where the blizzards lasted days, and the food ran low, and there was nothing to do but wait for spring and trust that spring would come, the men who came and went and failed, and the women who stayed and endured, and the specific unadorned texture of a life lived at the edge of what the American economy and American law and the American landscape would permit a family like hers to build. She also wrote down the Benders. In the earliest handwritten draft of Pioneer Girl, the Benders appear, but they appear briefly, with the slightly offhand quality of a story that has been told around the dinner table enough times to have been absorbed as family history, as part of the oral record of the Ingalls household, present but not yet central. Pa and the posse are there, the rifle above the door, the neighbour who comes at night, the ride out. But in the handwritten version, the Benders are not the climax. They are a detail. Then Rose typed it. Rose took the penciled school tablets and typed them. This is the documented fact at the centre of what the Pioneer Girl Project scholars, Pamela Smith Hill, Nancy Tistad Koopel, and the researchers at the South Dakota Historical Society, who spent years working through the manuscript's multiple drafts, identified as the most significant single editorial relationship in the history of American children's literature. The process was collaborative in a way that the final published books never quite acknowledged. Laura wrote, Rose rewrote. Laura responded to Rose's rewrites and sent back comments. Rose revised again. What moved between the farmhouse in Mansfield, Missouri, where Laura lived, and wherever Rose happened to be working, New York, Albania, Rocky Ridge, was not just a manuscript being polished. It was a story being rebuilt, with each draft asking the same implicit question that every commercial editor has always asked of every book sitting on a desk in front of them. What does this story need to do to sell? And the answer, in the early 1930s, in a country that was 3 years into the Great Depression and desperate for stories about people who had survived something brutal and come out the other side with their character intact, the answer was specific. It needed a hero. It needed danger. And it needed the hero to have faced the danger and prevailed. Here is what Rose Wilder Lane knew about criminal legends. She knew it not from academic study, but from years of working in the American press during the period when yellow journalism was not yet a term of criticism, but simply the air that newspapers breathed. She had learned from editors who understood that the distance between a documented horror and a marketable story was usually 1 or 2 specific decisions: who the camera follows, where the scene ends, and whether the hero gets to hold the rifle or merely hear about it afterward. When Rose looked at the Bender section of Pioneer Girl, she would have seen what any experienced journalist would have seen: an extraordinary historical connection, an authentic family proximity to one of the most famous criminal cases in American history, and a timing problem. The timing problem was real, and she knew it was real. The scholarly evidence suggests she understood the chronological gap. The annotated edition of Pioneer Girl, published in 2014 by the South Dakota Historical Society and edited by Pamela Smith Hill, includes editorial annotations identifying the chronological gap between the Ingalls, Kansas years and the 1873 Bender discovery, a gap the manuscript's multiple drafts navigate with notable care. She was not blind to them. She was a woman who had spent her career finding ways to make a story work, despite the complications that reality introduces into narrative. And what she understood, what every storyteller who has ever worked in the space between history and mythology understands, is that emotional truth and documented truth are not always the same thing. That a family who lived in Kansas in 1869, 1870 and 1871 on the same political landscape that produced the Benders, on the same troubled Osage land, on the same trail network that the Bender victims travelled, carried a proximity to that horror that the strict calendar of documented fact failed to fully honour. The Ingalls were there, not in May of 1873, but they were there. They breathed that air, they knew that country, they knew what it felt like to be a family alone on the Kansas prairie, with no law within a reasonable distance, and a canvas curtain between you and whatever the night brought to the door. Rose understood that this proximity was real. She also understood that it would not sell as proximity. It would sell as participation. The children got the golden version of Kansas. This is the line that sits at the heart of the Bender Ingalls story, and it is one that Laura herself seemed to understand with complete clarity. The Little House books, the series that begins with Little House in the Big Woods and ends, in the 8 volumes Laura herself completed, with these happy golden years, do not contain the Benders. The Benders are absent from every published book in the children's series, from every page that millions of American children read in school, from every chapter that parents read aloud to children at bedtime in the decades following the book's publication in the 1930s and 1940s. The children got sunlit meadows and wolf visits and fiddle music at dusk. The adults got the garden that would not stop giving up bodies. Laura made that division deliberately. She drew a line, clearly and with professional precision, between what she was willing to put in front of children and what she reserved for adult audiences. The Pioneer Girl manuscript, which circulated in various forms among literary agents and publishers in the early 1930s, before being set aside in favour of the children's series, was the adult document. The speeches, including the 1937 Detroit Address, were adult performances. The Benders belonged to the audience that could hold the full weight of the frontier without needing it softened. What this tells us about Laura Ingalls Wilder is not that she was dishonest. It tells us that she was 2 things simultaneously: an extraordinarily skilled children's author who understood exactly what a child needs from a story, and a woman who had spent her entire life carrying knowledge of what the frontier actually was, the fear, the violence, the proximity to genuine danger that the children's books paper over with a loving hand, and who needed somewhere, some place to put it down. The Bender story was where she put it down. Pa, with his rifle, riding out into the night, coming home, saying nothing. They will never be found. That story is not a lie about Charles Ingalls. It is a truth about what it felt like to be a child in Kansas in 1870, in a one-room cabin on the Osage Trail, in a landscape that produced the Benders as naturally and as inevitably as it produced the sunflowers and the creek and the wolf-pack crossing at dusk. It is the emotional residue of a childhood that was genuinely frightening, given form and shape and a hero at its centre, because the frontier that shaped Laura Ingalls Wilder demanded a hero, and Pa was the only candidate she had. But there is something else underneath all of this. Something that the Bender story, in all its mythologized glory, was also doing was a different kind of work to conceal. The Ingalls family was squatters, not settlers, not pioneers, not in the legal sense that the word implies a right to the land being pioneered. They were squatters on the Osage Diminished Reserve, people who had moved onto territory that the law, at the moment of their arrival, still recognised as belonging to the Osage Nation. Charles Ingalls knew this. Caroline Ingalls knew this. The 1870 census that recorded the family in Rutland Township recorded them as the 89th household, in a region where the Osage were still legally present, still moving through the landscape, still living on a reserve that had not yet been formally ceded. The Little House on the Prairie book, the children's version of the Kansas years, handles this with the particular kind of careful gentleness that a woman writing in the 1930s would apply to a subject that her audience was not culturally equipped to receive as criticism. Pa is sympathetic to the Osage. Pa objects when neighbours talk about them with contempt. Pa, in the children's version, is on the right side of the moral question to the extent that a man building a cabin on someone else's unceded land can be on the right side. But he was still on their land, and the Bender story, the story of Pa riding out with the vigilantes, Pa protecting the community, Pa as the active, righteous force against the most feared criminal family on the Kansas frontier, that story does something very specific for the Ingalls family's place in the mythology of the American West. It transforms them from squatters into defenders. It moves them from the morally uncomfortable position of illegal occupants of Osage land into the morally comfortable position of guardians of frontier justice. Frances W. Kay, in her foundational Great Plains Quarterly essay Little Squatter on the Osage Diminished Reserve, identified this dynamic with an exactness that the scholarship has not significantly improved upon since. The mythology the Ingalls family built around their Kansas years, the mythology that Rose helped shape and Laura endorsed, was doing the same work that frontier mythology always does, making the occupation of someone else's land feel not just necessary but righteous, making the people who took the land feel not just present but heroic. The Benders, in this reading, are not just serial killers who happen to operate in the same region. They are narrative tools. They are the darkness against which the Ingalls light gets measured. There is one more piece of this story, a piece that the newspapers of 1873, the pulp accounts of the 1880s, the speeches of the 1930s, and the children's books of the 1940s all managed in their different ways to place somewhere just outside the frame. The Osage. The Osage Nation had lived on the Kansas Prairie for generations before a federal treaty, and the particular arithmetic of railroad politics and settler demand made their continued presence in the territory incompatible with the expansion that men like Charles Ingalls, John Bender Sr. and hundreds of thousands of other families were counting on. The Osage removal of 1870, the forced march south from the diminished reserve to new territory in what is now Oklahoma, took place while the Ingalls family was still in Kansas. Laura, 3 years old, watched them go. She wrote about it. In the Little House books, the Osage departure is handled as an event that is simultaneously beautiful and sad, a procession of people and horses and dogs, a sound of voices in the distance, and then silence. The prairie settled back into stillness after the people who had known it most intimately were gone. A child's perception, filtered through a woman's pen, filtered through her daughter's editorial hand, filtered through the cultural assumptions of a country that in the 1930s had very specific ideas about what the movement of native peoples across the landscape meant and what it did not mean. What it meant, to be direct about it, was dispossession. The Osage did not leave because the Kansas frontier was finished with them. They left because the United States government, the railroad companies with land grants to develop, and the thousands of illegal squatters already on the reserve had made their presence economically and legally untenable. They were removed from a landscape they had cultivated and named and travelled for generations, and the families who had been squatting on that landscape, illegally, for years, were then allowed to purchase it at favourable rates. The Benders arrived as that process was completing. The Ingalls left as it was formalising. Both families, the killers and the storytellers, were beneficiaries of the same dispossession, operating on the same stolen ground, along the same trail that had been an Osage road before it was an American one. The Bender murders, horrifying as they were, claimed 11 lives over 2 years. The Osage removal displaced an entire nation, and the story America told about the Kansas frontier in the century and a half that followed focused, with remarkable consistency, on the 11, not in the nation. In the summer of 2023, exactly 150 years after the bodies were found in the Bender orchard, a team of archaeologists from the University of Kansas conducted a field school survey of the Bender homestead site near Cherryvale. They were looking, with the tools that 21st century archaeology provides, for what the 1873 investigation may have missed, for evidence of victims who were never identified, for physical remains of the operation that the searchers with their shovels in May of that year did not reach or did not recognize. They found the site. They found structural remains consistent with the homestead layout described in the 1873 investigation. And the investigation continues. The earth in Labette County, Kansas, has not yet given up everything it holds. The trapdoor. I want to come back to it, one final time, because it is the image that this entire story has been circling from the very first sentence. The image that contains, in its plain wooden reality, everything that the Bender case means, and everything that the mythology built around it has been working, for 150 years, to keep at bay. A trapdoor in the floor of a room, a door that opens downward, that leads not to another room, not to safety, not to anything a traveller sitting above it would want to find, but to a cellar, small and dark and soaked, where the evidence of what happened in the room above eventually collected. The Benders built that door deliberately. They knew what it was for. They knew that a room can look entirely normal, entirely safe, entirely welcoming. A table, a meal, a conversation with a charming young woman who listens to you the way people rarely listen. While directly beneath the floorboards, something else entirely waits. The frontier worked like that trapdoor. The mythology worked like that trapdoor. The Little House books worked like that trapdoor. Beautiful on top, carefully constructed, welcoming to children and families and anyone who comes to it in good faith. And beneath the boards, if you know where to look, if you are willing to lift the latch and look down, the harder story. The Osage removal, the illegal squatting, the proximity to real violence, the fear that a 3-year-old girl absorbed from the adults around her and carried forward into a life, a career, and a legend that has been read by more Americans than almost any other work of the 20th century. Kate Bender built the trapdoor that killed 11 people. Laura Ingalls Wilder built a different kind. One that kept the hardest truths about the frontier just below the surface of a story that a country needed to believe was golden. Both women were products of the same Kansas. Both understood that what a room shows you is not always what a room contains. And both of them, the killer who vanished and the author who endured, understood something that the rest of us are still learning to sit with, that the most dangerous things are often the ones that look most like home. Somewhere out there, in whatever life she built after she walked away from that empty cabin, in April of 1873, Kate Bender may have read Laura's books. She would have been old by then, assuming she lived. Assuming she lived quietly, under a name nobody recognized, in a town where nobody knew what Kansas looked like from the inside of a one-room cabin divided by a canvas curtain. She would have read about the Prairie, about Pa's fiddle, about the golden light, and she would have known, the way only someone who had lived on that same prairie, breathed that same air, built her own system in that same landscape could know, that the golden light was real, and that it was not the whole story. It was never the whole story. It was only what you could see from above the door. They left on a train. That is the one documented fact about the Benders' escape that the historical record offers with any confidence. And even this is partial, tentative, and incomplete in the ways that matter most. The Benders' abandoned wagon was found just outside Thayer, Kansas. The horses still hitched, starving, one mare lame. Investigators confirmed that the family had bought tickets at Thayer on the Leavenworth, Lawrence, and Galveston Railroad, bound for Humboldt. From Humboldt, the trail split. Kate and John Jr. heading south toward Indian Territory, the elder pair tracked toward St. Louis in Missouri. After that, nothing. The Thayer connection appears in multiple independent accounts and is treated by historians as the closest thing to a confirmed piece of the escape route that exists. After Thayer, the trail disappears, not gradually. Not with the slow fading of a path that becomes harder to follow with each mile. It disappears the way a person disappears when they have planned the disappearance. Cleanly, completely, with the specific efficiency of people who understood that the frontier they were fleeing was too vast and too loosely governed to follow them wherever they chose to go. The Benders had spent 2 years studying how the Kansas frontier managed information. They had watched how long it took for a missing person report to travel between counties. They had observed, close up, the pace at which official concern moved on a landscape where the nearest law enforcement was measured in riding hours. They had learned, at operational cost, exactly how long a family could be gone before anyone noticed. They used all of it. The rumours began within days of the bodies being found. This is the part of the Bender story that has received less attention than it deserves, because the rumours are where the case stops being a crime and starts becoming a legend. And the transition happened so quickly, so naturally, that most of the people participating in it did not notice it was happening. Within weeks of the May 1873 discovery, reports began to circulate in Kansas and regional newspapers that the Benders had been caught. Privately, by a vigilante committee, that they had been brought to a field somewhere in southeastern Kansas and executed without trial, and that their bodies had been disposed of in ways that would ensure they were never found, thrown into the Verdigris River, buried in an unmarked grave on the open prairie, burned somewhere in the Kansas dark. The stories were specific. They had names attached to them. The men who supposedly carried out the execution were identified in some accounts, unnamed in others, described in terms that the frontier community of 1873 would have understood as honourable. Serious men, responsible men, men who understood that the legal system was too slow and too uncertain to be trusted with something this monstrous. Colonel Alexander York, a Kansas state senator and Civil War veteran, who had spent months riding across Labette County looking for his brother, who had organised a posse of approximately 50 men, who had identified Dr. York's body in the Bender orchard, spent years afterward investigating these stories. He could not corroborate them. The official correspondence on the Bender case, preserved in state records and reviewed by subsequent historians, continued to treat the family's fate as unknown for decades after 1873. No court ever accepted a vigilante execution as a fact. No reward was ever paid. What York knew, and what the rumours obscured, was the harder truth. The Benders were probably alive, probably in another state, probably using different names. And the frontier that had failed to stop them for 2 years had now, by the specific accident of its own geographic scale, failed to catch them too. The vigilante stories were not lies exactly. They were what a community tells itself when the alternative, that the people who murdered 11 of your neighbours walked away and were never found, is too difficult to absorb. In the years that followed 1873, something happened to Kate Bender in the American press that is worth examining closely, because it tells you more about the culture that produced it than it tells you about the woman it was supposedly describing. The transformation happened in 3 stages. In the first stage, the summer and fall of 1873, in the immediate aftermath of the discovery, Kate was described primarily in terms of danger and abnormality. The Harper's Weekly characterization of her as repulsive-looking with a vicious and cruel eye was part of a pattern in which the press needed to explain how a woman had participated in serial killing, and the explanation the press reached for was the one it always reaches for in these cases. She must have been visibly monstrous, something that a careful person would have recognized immediately and avoided. The violence was possible because she was not really a woman. In the way the press's audience understood women, she was something else. Something that only looked like a woman from the outside. This framing served a specific function. It removed the discomfort of the alternative. Because the alternative, that Kate Bender had been in a room with hundreds of ordinary people, had talked to them and fed them, and given them no visible reason to fear her, and that ordinary people are simply not very good at identifying violence when it is sitting across from them being charming. That alternative was far more frightening than a monster with a vicious eye. The second stage came in the 1880s and 1890s, as the Benders became the subject of pulp pamphlets, serialized newspaper stories, and the early true crime literature that was emerging as a commercial genre in those decades. In this phase, the press discovered that a different version of Kate sold better than the monster. The vicious eye gave way to a bold beauty. The coarseness of the 1873 accounts was smoothed into something more theatrical, a dark charisma, a seductive intelligence, a woman who had not merely survived at the frontier, but had bent it to her will in a way that was, in the particular fever dream of pulp publishing, almost admirable. This was not accurate. This was appetite. The reading public of the 1880s and 1890s had a specific hunger for stories about women who operated outside the boundaries of what women were supposed to want and be, and Kate Bender, rewritten by a press that had every commercial incentive to give the audience what it wanted, became a vessel for that hunger. She was dangerous, yes, but she was dangerous in a way that the pulp press found easier to market than to condemn. She was a woman who had looked at the frontier and decided with cold intelligence to take it rather than merely survive it. The third stage happened in the 20th century, when the Bender case was absorbed into the emerging genre of American true crime, and Kate's image was codified into the archetype she occupies in popular culture today. The femme fatale of the frontier, the dark mirror of the domestic pioneer woman, the spiritualist killer whose hammer and hymns represent the gap between what the American West said it was and what it actually was. None of these versions is fully accurate. All of them are fully revealing. Here is the thing about the widows. They have no chapter in most tellings of the Bender story. The men who died in the Bender orchard are named Dr. William York, George Newton Longcor, Ben Brown, W.F. McCrotty, Henry Mackenzie, John Greery, Johnny Boyle, the others, and their names anchor the case in the specific human reality of what was lost. But the women they left behind, the people who received the news of those recovered bodies in the summer of 1873 and had to carry that knowledge forward into lives that were already hard by any measure, do not appear in the newspaper accounts of 1873 except at the edges in passing references. We do not know most of their names. We do not know what happened to the wives of the men who disappeared and were never found until someone dug up an orchard. We do not know how the families of the unidentified victims, the men whose names were never definitively established, who went into the Bender ground as strangers and came out still strangers, claimed by no one, managed the particular species of grief that comes from knowing without knowing, from having a husband or a father or a son who simply ceased to exist somewhere along a Kansas road. The frontier produced this kind of grief in industrial quantities. Men died in accidents, in the weather, in the ordinary violence of a landscape that had not yet been tamed by the infrastructure that makes modern life legible. The women who stayed, who raised children alone, who worked land alone, who sat in one-room cabins in Kansas winters alone and waited for spring. Those women are the background against which the frontier mythology was painted. They are the ones who made the survival stories possible by surviving. And in the Bender case specifically, there is a cruelty in the gap between what the newspapers covered and what the widows experienced that is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is the same gap that Francis Kay and other scholars who have written about the gendered dimensions of frontier violence have identified as one of the story's most under-examined aspects. The front page of American journalism in 1873 was occupied by the Benders, the back rooms of the frontier where women were processing loss, raising children on reduced income, managing land and livestock and debt alone. Those rooms were not covered. They rarely were. There is a direct line from the jurisdictional gap that allowed the Benders to operate for 2 years on a public road in a settled community, and a problem that exists in the United States today. The outline for this video, in its section on why this story matters in 2025 and beyond, identifies the parallel that historians and scholars of frontier lawlessness have drawn. The epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women, the MMIW crisis, involves precisely the same structural conditions that allowed the Benders to function. Remote geography, jurisdictional complexity between federal, state, tribal and county law enforcement, communities where certain kinds of disappearances receive less official attention than others, a landscape where some people's absence is absorbed more quietly than other people's absence. The Bender victims were travellers, people whose disappearance could be explained in the ordinary vocabulary of frontier movement. The systemic vulnerability that made them invisible also makes present-day victims of rural violence invisible in some of the same ways. This is not a comfortable parallel to draw. It is not drawn here to make the Bender case feel more relevant by attaching it to contemporary tragedy. It is drawn because the outline for this video, built on the scholarship of people who have studied frontier lawlessness carefully and honestly, identifies it as a real historical connection, one that the evidence supports and that responsible telling of the Bender case in 2025 cannot simply omit. The structures that fail communities fail them in patterns. The pattern that failed the travellers on the Osage Trail in 1871 and 1872 is not a 19th century artefact. In Cherryvale, Kansas today, the small town that grew up near the site of the Bender homestead and has been living in the gravitational pull of the murders for 150 years, The relationship between the community and its most famous history is complicated in ways that deserve to be named rather than simply celebrated. The Kansas State Historical Society holds artifacts from the Bender case, including items attributed to the murder operation. These artifacts have periodically been the subject of local controversy, in which the residents of Cherryvale have had to confront the specific, exhausting problem of being known primarily for something that happened on their land a century and a half ago and that they had no part in. The Bender Mounds, the low rises in the earth near the homestead site that mark where the structures once stood, are a feature of the landscape that most Cherryvale residents know about, and few outside of serious historians make the effort to visit. The University of Kansas Field School survey that was conducted in the area in recent years found structural remains consistent with the historical record. They are still sifting. The investigation of the Bender site has not ended. The earth that held 11 bodies, and possibly more, is still being examined by people with the tools and the patience to ask what it has not yet given up. This is the specific, unhurried work of archaeology, not the dramatic excavations of television documentaries, not the shovel and surprise of the 1873 community search, but the slow, systematic, grid-by-grid examination of a piece of Kansas land that has been carrying 150 years of history in its soil and is being asked, finally, to release it. Whether it will is another question. The earth in Labette County has been good at keeping secrets. There is something I want to give you before we leave this story, not a fact. You have had the facts, all of them that can be documented and verified and honestly labelled for what they are. You have the dates, you have the geography, you have the gap between where the Ingalls family was and where the story later placed them. You have the train ticket at Thayer, you have the uncollected reward, you have the 1889 Michigan arrest that collapsed the 2 Michigan women arrested as Ma and Kate Bender, brought to Kansas, never positively identified, and released. You have the 2014 annotated edition that put the scholarly record on the table and said, plainly, here is what we know and here is what we do not. What I want to give you is smaller than a fact and larger than a fact, and it is this. The Benders were real. The fear they generated was real. The Kansas that produced them, the lawless, beautiful, stolen, blood-soaked Kansas of 1871 and 1872 and 1873 was real. And the women who lived in that Kansas, who built lives in one-room cabins on contested land, who raised children without adequate medical care or law enforcement, or any guarantee that the wagon carrying their husband would come back up the road at the end of the day, those women were real. Their fear was real. Their endurance was real. And the stories they needed to tell about that fear, the stories that put a rifle in a good man's hands and a hero at the centre of the darkness, were not lies. They were the tools that ordinary people have always used to survive, with the knowledge of what the world actually is. Laura Ingalls Wilder did not invent the Benders. She found them in the newspaper, the way the rest of America found them, and she understood immediately what they meant, not just as a crime, but as a truth about the country she'd grown up in. A country where the domestic space, the table, the hearth, and the ordinary hospitality of a family's home could be turned against you without warning. A country where the woman pouring your coffee might be the most dangerous person in the room. A country where the garden was always freshly turned for reasons you didn't stop to question, because you had your own crops to plant and your own children to feed, and your own curtain to hang between yourself and the dark. She put Pa on a horse and sent him into the dark because it was the only version of the story that made the dark survivable. We do not have to agree with that choice to understand it. We do not have to forgive the myth to appreciate what it was protecting. Kate Bender has been gone for 150 years. No confirmed grave, no confirmed capture, no confirmed anything, beyond the spring morning in 1873, when she walked out of a Kansas cabin and into a country so vast and so loosely governed that it simply swallowed her. Somewhere out there, in whatever life she built, in whatever name she used, in whatever state, Kate Bender eventually stopped feeling like Kansas. She would have had mornings, ordinary ones, coffee, perhaps, a window with light coming through it, the particular silence of a person who knows something about themselves that no one around them knows, and has learned to live inside that silence the way other people live inside their names. Whether she felt anything about what she had done is a question the historical record cannot answer. Whether she thought about the orchard, whether she thought about Mary Ann Longcor, whether the years gave her anything resembling remorse, or simply gave her more years, quietly, in an unremarkable town in an unremarkable house, with an unremarkable name above the door. We will never know. That is the final, honest answer. Not the ending that the story's shape seems to demand. Not justice, not a grave marker, not a satisfying accounting, just silence. The specific silence of a case that never closed, carried forward by historians and archaeologists and scholars and documentary makers, and by every person who has ever read Little House on the Prairie and felt, somewhere beneath the sunlit meadows, the faint vibration of something the book was very carefully not saying. The Osage knew this land before the settlers came. The settlers built their stories on top of what was already there. The Benders built a different kind of story, one with a trapdoor in it. And the earth is still turning. In Labette County, Kansas, in the quiet southeast corner of the state, in the low grass near the place where a cabin once stood on the Osage Trail. The earth is still turning, and the field school is still sifting, and the records are still incomplete, and the reward is still uncollected. And in Cherryvale, in a town that has been trying to outlive its most famous residents for 150 years, the Bender hammers sit behind bulletproof glass in the Cherryvale Historical Museum, or most of them do. One vanished on Halloween night in 2024, taken by someone who wanted a piece of the darkness for themselves, and has not been seen since. The ones that remain are real, not legendary, not mythologized, just iron, wood, and weight, and whatever they remember. The Benders left a void, not just in Labette County, not just in the lives of the families who had lost someone on the Osage Trail. They left a void in the American story, and when a story has a void in it, the country does not leave it alone. It fills it. Over and over again, with whatever material the cultural moment happens to have on hand, it fills the void with something that feels like an answer, even when the honest answer is that there is none. This chapter is about what got poured into that void over the next 150 years, and some of what got poured in was justice, and some of it was fiction dressed as justice, and some of it was cruelty wearing the mask of both. In the weeks immediately following the discovery of the orchard in May of 1873, the community around Cherryvale did something that frontier communities throughout American history have done when the official machinery of law moves too slowly or too uncertainly. It acted on its own. Vigilante committees formed across Labette County. Men with rifles and grievances rode out in organized groups, stopping strangers, questioning travelers, looking for anyone who resembled the descriptions that newspapers had already begun circulating of the missing Bender family. Most of what they found was nothing, but one of what they found was a man named Rudolf Brockmann. Brockmann was a German immigrant farmer who had been a neighbour of the Benders, close enough to have socialised with the family, close enough to have shared meals and conversation, and the ordinary proximity that rural frontier life demanded of people living near each other. After the bodies were discovered, that proximity became a liability. The vigilante committees decided, without anything resembling a legal process, that Brockmann had known what the Benders were doing, that he had aided them, or at minimum had looked away from evidence that a more honest neighbour would have reported. What the committees did to Rudolf Brockmann is documented in the Labette County histories and in newspaper accounts from 1873. They tortured him. They used what the period called rough treatment, ropes, threats, physical violence, trying to extract a confession or a piece of information that would justify what they had already done to him. He had no confession to give because the evidence that he was complicit in the Bender murders was never established. He was released eventually without being charged with anything. Rudolf Brockmann does not appear in the Bender legend the way Kate does, or the way the victims do. He appears in the footnotes, in the county histories, in the places where careful historians record the things that happened in the wake of the case that do not fit neatly into the moral framework the legend prefers. He is the part of the story that demonstrates what frontier justice looked like when it moved faster than evidence. A German immigrant, already regarded with suspicion, in a community shaken by the revelation that German immigrants had been murdering their neighbours, subjected to mob violence that the law did not stop and did not punish. His story is not a comfortable addition to the Bender narrative, it is an essential one. 5 myths had grown up around the Benders by the time the dust of 1873 settled, and all 5 of them had been doing damage to the historical record ever since, which means that before we go any further, we need to name them plainly, because this channel does not traffic in comfortable errors. The first myth is one you have already heard debunked in this documentary, but it bears restating in the context of everything we now know. That Pa Ingalls ate dinner over the Benders' trapdoor and later helped hunt them down. The land records, the census, the documented Ingalls' departure from Kansas in May of 1871, and the documented discovery of the Bender bodies in May of 1873 make this encounter literally impossible as described. The Pioneer Girl Project scholars have confirmed it. The Great Plains Quarterly has published on it. The 2014 annotated edition of Pioneer Girl placed it in writing for anyone willing to read carefully. The myth persists because a story about a beloved father protecting his family feels more satisfying than the truth, which is that the Ingalls were 400 miles away in Minnesota when any of it happened. The second myth, the Benders killed over 30, or dozens of victims. The documented minimum is 11 bodies recovered from the orchard, and surrounding land. Some accounts and later estimates reach into the mid-teens when scattered remains and Drum Creek victims are included. Estimates above that, the over 20 and possibly 30 that appear in pulp accounts and some internet summaries, are not supported by the primary evidence from the 1873 investigation. 11 confirmed is the number that the historical record supports. Everything above it is possible, but it is in the category scholars label uncertain, which means it should be presented as speculation, not a fact. The third myth, the Benders were definitely caught and executed by vigilantes, their bodies disposed of in the Verdigris River, or burned or buried in unmarked graves on the prairie. Multiple versions of this story circulated from 1873 onward. None of them was ever corroborated by a legal record, a claimed reward, a physical body, or testimony that survived legal scrutiny. Senator Alexander York, who had more reason than anyone to want this story to be true, spent years investigating every vigilante claim and could not verify a single one. The combined $3,000 in reward money, $2,000 from Governor Thomas Osborne and $1,000 from Senator Alexander York himself, was never collected. The official correspondence treated the Benders' fate as unknown for decades. The vigilante execution stories are what a community tells itself when an open wound needs a closing stitch that the evidence refuses to provide. The fourth myth, that Laura Ingalls Wilder omitted the Bender episode from the Little House children's book solely because the violence was too frightening for young readers. She said this herself in the 1937 Detroit speech, and there is no reason to dismiss it entirely. A woman who had spent decades carefully calibrating what her children's audience could hold did exercise genuine judgment about age appropriateness. But modern editors and Pioneer Girl Project scholars have pointed out a second, equally compelling reason for the omission. The Bender episode, as Laura told it in adult settings, flatly contradicted the chronology of the books. Including it in the children's series would have placed the Ingalls family in Kansas during events that happened 2 years after they had left. The books could not absorb a story that was internally incompatible with their own timeline. The too frightening for children explanation is partial. The it would have broken the internal logic of the series explanation is at least as important. The fifth myth is the quietest, and, in some ways, the most enduring. That the Ingalls family was innocent homesteaders caught up by proximity and violence that had nothing to do with them. The land records, the census documentation, and the scholarship of Francis Kay and the Pioneer Girl Project researchers make clear that Charles Ingalls settled as a squatter on the Osage Diminished Reserve, land that was legally Osage territory at the time, land that the Osage had been promised in treaty language, and were in the process of being pressured, manoeuvred, and ultimately forced off of. The Ingalls were not uniquely villainous in this. The 89th family recorded in Rutland Township before them had made the same calculation, and so had the families after. but they were participants in the displacement process, not bystanders. The golden prairie of the Little House books was Osage land first. That fact does not disappear because the books do not acknowledge it. The Benders' disappearance created an opening, and American popular culture, which has never been shy about filling openings, moved in immediately. Within a decade of 1873, the Benders had become the subject of dime novels and pamphlets, the paperback equivalents of the era, printed cheaply and sold at train stations and general stores to readers who had an apparently unlimited appetite for the story of the family that had murdered their way across the Kansas frontier and then walked away clean. The dime novel versions were not constrained by the evidence. They were not written by people who had read the Labette County histories carefully and weighed conflicting sources. They were written by people who understood what sold, and what sold in 1880 was exactly what sells in 2026. A woman at the centre of something monstrous, rendered in the most dramatic possible terms, with a resolution that felt satisfying even when the historical record refused to provide one. Kate Bender in the dime novels bore a diminishing relationship to Kate Bender in the primary sources. The documented woman, bold, publicly lecturing spiritualist, described in sharply contradictory terms by people who actually encountered her, was replaced by a figure whose characteristics shifted to match whatever the market wanted in a given decade. Seductive when seductive sold, monstrous when monstrous sold, mysterious when mystery was in fashion. The dime novels gave readers what they came for, and what they came for was not accuracy. This is not a small thing to understand about how the Bender case travelled through American culture. The version most people carry in their heads today, the hypnotic Kate drawing victims to their deaths with supernatural charm, the family as a unit of pure, coordinated evil, the murders as something almost theatrical rather than methodical and economically motivated. That version was largely assembled not from 1873 courthouse records, but from the literature of a culture that needed the story to mean something larger than 11 bodies in a Kansas orchard. It needed to mean something about what women were capable of. It needed to mean something about what the frontier concealed beneath its promise. It needed to mean something about the domestic space, the table, the meal, the offer of warmth and rest, turned against the people it was supposed to protect. All of those meanings are real. All of them are present in the actual documented case, but they accumulated layers of fiction on top of the facts until, by the mid-20th century, the facts themselves had become almost inaccessible without deliberate excavation. In 1961, the town of Cherryvale opened a small museum dedicated to the Bender case. The centerpiece was 3 hammers, physical objects recovered from or attributed to the Bender homestead, preserved behind glass, the most tangible remaining evidence of a case that had no trial, no conviction, no official conclusion of any kind. The museum also held other artifacts, items recovered from the property, documents from the investigation, the material residue of a crime that had been studied, written about, and theorized over for nearly 90 years by the time the museum opened its doors. The museum later closed, partly because of something that communities associated with famous crimes often discover eventually. Being known primarily for something terrible that happened on your land a century ago is a complicated kind of fame to live with. The artifacts moved to the Cherryvale Museum, where they remain. The hammers are still there, behind glass. In a county that has been trying to be more than the sum of what those hammers did for 150 years. At some point in the discussions about how to tell the Bender story to a wider audience, someone, the historical record on this point is, fittingly somewhat vague, suggested that the right actress to play Kate Bender in a potential film adaptation was Raquel Welch. This is a detail that deserves a moment of your attention, not because the film was ever made, but because of what the casting suggestion reveals. Raquel Welch, at the height of her fame in the late 1960s, and the years when this conversation was likely happening, was one of the most recognizable symbols of a specific kind of female magnetism in American popular culture. The suggestion that she should play Kate Bender tells you everything about how far Kate had travelled from the contradictory, documented, historically uncertain woman of the primary sources, the woman described as repulsive-looking in Harper's Weekly and good-looking, well-formed, rather bold in other accounts. and how completely she had been reconstructed as a figure of dangerous glamour. The real Kate Bender, whoever she was, had given a public lecture on spiritualism in a Kansas county in 1872. The Kate Bender who was being cast in movies was Raquel Welch. The distance between those two women is the distance between history and legend. It is a long way. The scholars who changed how serious historians think about the Bender case did not arrive with dramatic revelations or Hollywood budgets. They arrived with annotated footnotes. The 2014 publication of Pioneer Girl, the annotated autobiography, produced by the South Dakota State Historical Society Press and edited by Pamela Smith Hill, was the moment that the scholarly reassessment of the Ingalls-Bender connection became accessible to a general readership rather than confined to academic journals. The annotations gave readers, for the first time in a widely distributed format, the specific tools to evaluate what Wilder claimed against what the records showed, not as an attack on the Little House series, which the editors were careful to frame sympathetically, but as an honest accounting of the gap between memory, myth, and documentation. Francis Kay's work in Great Plains Quarterly, along with essays published through the Pioneer Girl project, expanded the frame further, placing the Ingalls and Bender stories not just in the context of American literary history, but in the context of Osage dispossession, frontier gender dynamics, and the specific mechanisms by which settler narratives erase the more complicated truths of what actually happened on the land they describe. The KU archaeology field school work at the Bender property, drawing on remote sensing and careful excavation, began to build a more grounded physical picture of the homestead. Not the theatrical stage set of dime novels and true crime podcasts, but the actual dimensions of a one-room cabin on a Kansas hillside, the actual layout of the orchard, the actual soil that had held the bodies, and that the passage of 150 years had not entirely given up. This is what the 21st century brought to the Bender case. Not resolution, but rigour. Not a clean ending, but a more honest accounting of what we know, what we do not know, and what we have been filling in with legend for a century and a half. There is a word for this kind of scholarship. The word is necessary. Here is what we know at the end of 6 chapters and 150 years. We know a family of 4 arrived on the Kansas frontier sometime around 1870 and 1871. We know they chose their land for the road that ran alongside it. We know they opened an inn. We know they murdered at least 11 people. We know the youngest victim was a child named Mary Ann Longcor, whose father had been murdered in the standard Bender fashion, and who was found buried with him. We know the Benders fled in April of 1873. We know they boarded trains at Thayer. We know the trail disappeared after that, completely and permanently. We know that a German immigrant named Rudolf Brockmann was tortured by vigilantes who needed someone to hold accountable, and chose proximity as evidence. We know that 2 women were arrested in Niles, Michigan, in 1889, Elmira Monroe Griffith and Sarah Eliza Davis, and accused of being Ma and Kate Bender. We know that affidavits placed both women in Michigan prison and marriage records during key years of the Kansas murders. We know a Kansas judge reviewed the evidence and released them. We know the question of whether they were actually the Benders' remains, in the technical language of historical scholarship, disputed. We know that Mrs. Frances E. McCann, daughter of one of the suspected victims, believed for years that her dreams about her father's death had given her information that led to the Niles identification. We know that her grief and her certainty were real, and that neither was sufficient to close the case. We know that the daughters, wives, and mothers of the Bender victims carried the weight of an open case for the rest of their lives, without resolution, without a verdict, without the closing statement that the legal system is supposed to provide, and that this case was never delivered. We know that Laura Ingalls Wilder told a story about her father riding out into the Kansas dark. We know that Rose Wilder Lane made that story sharper and more useful with each draft. We know that the Pioneer Girl Project scholars documented the gap between what Laura wrote in her own hand and what the typed versions, shaped by Rose's editorial instincts, produced. We know that the story Laura told cannot be literally true in the form she told it. And we know, this is the piece that 21st century scholarship has been most careful and most clear about, that none of that makes Laura Ingalls Wilder a fraud, and none of it makes the Little House books lies, and none of it erases the genuine documented life of a family that moved across the American frontier in wagons and built homes in places where homes had not existed before, in conditions that we can barely imagine from the distance of the 21st century. What makes her a human being? What makes the books is a particular kind of truth. The truth of what a family needed its story to be, shaped by the craft of a professional writer, offered to a Depression-era American readership that had its own reasons for wanting to believe in a father who rode out into the dark and came home quiet and capable and whole. There is a daughter in this story who does not get discussed enough. Her name is not Laura. Her name is not Kate. Her name is Carrie Ingalls, the baby who was born in August of 1870 in Montgomery County, Kansas, in the middle of the Osage Diminished Reserve, less than a year before her family loaded their wagon and turned northeast back toward their cabin near Pepin, Wisconsin. She was not yet a year old when they left. She has no memories of Kansas at all. She grew up reading her sister's books about the life they had lived. She grew up with the stories Pa had told, and the stories Rose had sharpened, and the stories that the American reading public had turned into a mythology. She grew up inside a narrative about her own childhood that she was too young to have experienced consciously, and too embedded to evaluate from the outside. All of us carry some version of this. A story about where we come from that was told to us before we were old enough to fact-check it. That became part of how we understand ourselves, that we pass forward to the next generation because the alternative, the open, uncomfortable uncertainty of not knowing, is harder to live in than even a story that isn't entirely true. The frontier asked its children to do this on a scale most of us will never encounter, and the children mostly obliged. The Benders are buried somewhere, probably, in soil that belonged first to the Osage, then to the settlers, then to the state, then to the decades, in a country that has never been good at sitting still long enough to finish the stories it starts. Under a sky that looks, on a clear evening in southeastern Kansas, exactly the way it looked in the spring of 1873, when Alexander York and his men found the first of the bodies, and understood, in the particular silence that follows an unbearable discovery, that the world they had been living in was not the world they thought it was. That silence is what this series has been sitting in, not to make the darkness comfortable, not to resolve what the evidence refuses to resolve, but to stay with it long enough to understand what it contains. The orchard is gone. The cabin is gone. The road has changed its name more than once, but the questions are still there, patient as soil, waiting for the next person who is willing to stop and look closely at a piece of Kansas prairie and ask what it remembers. We have been asking for 6 chapters. The answer, as honest answers often are, is more than we expected and less than we need. That will have to be enough. For now.